Hi, my name is Cindy and I'll be sharing a little bit about my work today. So I'm an artist, but I also used to be a scientist for many, many years. And a lot of people think that science and art are like opposites, but in fact they share a lot in common. And a lot of my artwork actually shows the influence of my background as a biologist. For example, sometimes you see it in the shapes of things I make. I made some sculptures out of plastic pipettes that I used to use in lab when I was a biologist, and they look kind of like blobby creatures, don't you think? Another way that science makes its way into my work is in ideas or processes. For example, in biology, there are a lot of repetitive processes that end up producing these really complicated patterns and structures. So I used a very simple iterative process, finger knitting, which maybe you've done before. And first I just took some yarn and finger knitted it into a very long strand on my fingers. And then I knitted that on some even bigger fingers that I made with balloons. That made a thicker strand, which then I knit on some even bigger fingers that I made by stuffing some socks. I then tossed that into my washing machine to felt the yarn. It's like this process where it kind of pulls everything together. It's similar to a process called fixation that biologists use to essentially freeze everything in place and preserve tissue samples. I then cut into it to see what it looked like inside. And again, it's very similar to what I used to do in the lab, cutting slices of tissue to see what the sample looked like inside. And as you can see here, this actually looks very similar to a biological tissue sample, if you've ever seen one of those. Finally, you might have already caught on to this, but experimentation is a huge part of my work. I really like to play around with materials, often ones that have some special meaning to me. For example, I'm going to show you some work that I made using emergency blankets. So I'd seen some videos of refugees who were people who had to flee danger in their own countries and go to a new place. And as they landed ashore in this new country that they'd never seen before after a really scary boat ride, someone welcomed them ashore by wrapping an emergency blanket around their shoulders to help keep them warm. And this moment of welcome was almost like a hug. It was something that I just loved so much, even though I was worried about what the refugees might be facing in the future as they tried to find a new home and settle in. And so I started making work out of emergency blankets. And here I've used emergency blankets to make toys. Now, these blankets work pretty well at keeping you warm, but they're really fragile. If you poke a hole in them or get a little tear, they just kind of tear apart really easily. So they're meant to be temporary, but I wanted to prolong this moment of welcome and the sense that maybe those of us who are not in danger in our own countries could find a way to welcome them here where we are. And sadly, there are actually a lot of kids who are refugees, so I was thinking of them as I made these toys. And the stuffed bunny was made from strips of emergency blankets that I twisted into a yarn and then crocheted. And the jump rope was made in a similar way, twisting this really fragile material into a strong rope that could be used to play with. And with the soccer ball, I was thinking of how a lot of kids who are refugees make their own ball to play with, just out of whatever materials they can find. I also made another piece of artwork out of emergency blankets that looks like a parachute that's either just catching the wind or floating down to the ground. And in making this, I was thinking about a game that maybe you've played before, where you and a bunch of other kids stand all around the outside of a parachute, and then you all fling it up in the air at once, and it forms this little dome. And then kids can run across to the other side underneath this dome before it collapses back down. And then there they find some new neighbors on the other side. So next time you meet someone who came from a different country and maybe just seems different from you, I would really love for you to think about this parachute and just invite them to be your friend and to play with you. Thanks for watching. Check out my demo video for some ways that you can use materials that are just probably lying around your house to start making some artwork.